Some of us in political life have a tendency to look at the Middle East too much in terms of the Israeli-Arab struggle. We look at Israel, a strong, free nation in the Middle East, and we look at its neighbors, its aggressive neighbors, the UAR in Syria, and we see this struggle, and we say, well, are we going to give planes to Israel? And are the Russians going to give them to the UAR? And how are we going to have a settlement between Israel and the Arab states? If that's all there was to it, it wouldn't be as difficult a problem as I'm going to put it. I think the Middle East now is terribly dangerous. It's like the Balkans before World War I, where the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, could be drawn into a confrontation that neither of them wants because of the differences there. When we then look at it in terms of Israeli versus Arabs, moderate Arabs versus radical Arabs, and whoever would think that there would be somebody more radical than the Syrians, within the radical Arab states fitting in that are more radical, the super radicals. When we think of all these factors, we can see what a very difficult situation it is. Now, what should U.S. policy be? I'll summarize it in a word. One, our interest is peace and the integrity of every country in the area. Two, we recognize that Israel is not desirous of driving any of the other countries into the sea. The other countries do want to drive Israel into the sea. Three, then, once the balance of power shifts where Israel is weaker than its neighbors, there will be a war. Therefore, it is in U.S. interest to maintain the balance of power.
Welcome back to the Grand Strategy Summit. I hope you all are enjoying your lunch. And we're going to continue with our next session, which will look at some conflicts and hotspots around the world with a view of grand strategy and long-term thinking. Joining us today on this session is Congressman Zach Nunn, who represents Iowa's 3rd Congressional District and is serving his 2nd term in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Nunn served nearly 2 decades in the U.S. Air Force as an airborne intelligence officer, flying missions over Russia, China, and the Middle East, logging more than 700 combat hours after 9/11. He later served as Director of Cybersecurity at the White House National Security Council and now serves as a colonel in the Air Force Reserve. In Congress, Representative Nunn serves on the House Financial Services Committee and the House Agriculture Committee. He also serves on the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. Joining Congressman Nunn is Secretary Robert Wilkie, who served as the 10th Secretary of Veterans Affairs, confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2018. He previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness under Secretary James Mattis, advising on readiness, National Guard, Reserve Affairs, Health Affairs training, and the quality of life for our military families. He's the chairman of the Center for American Security at the American First Policy Institute and serves as a senior national security analyst for Newsmax. Son of an Army Artillery commander, Secretary Wilkie has over 20 years of federal service across multiple administrations and continues to advocate for those who serve and defend our nation. And I'd also like to welcome back Katie Pavlich to lead this discussion. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
All right. Now we're here for the afternoon. I hope everyone's enjoying their lunch. Little tip on the microphone, hold it above, not the bottom. It will turn off, so that's the tip we know about. It's wonderful to be back with you again this afternoon. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us. So we're going to talk about a number of hot spots around the world, some of them hopefully becoming cooler spots. The most recently, I had the privilege of traveling with President Trump in the press pool to Israel and Egypt on his whirlwind peace agreement tour. That was amazing to land in Israel, watch him walk into the Knesset, get that reception from the people there, and then move on to Egypt, where almost 40 leaders flew in last minute to agree to help with this new ceasefire plan and expansion of the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. So I think we should start there. Just both of your assessments on where we are with that. I know the ceasefire is always, of course, fragile. There's lots of moving parts, but let's start with an overview of your kind of opinions and thoughts on this current situation between Israel, Gaza, and the broader Middle East.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody here who took the time out to not only engage in geopolitics, but talk about some of the really cutting-edge items. You know, for combat veterans here who have served, we're looking at this through a 20-year forever war situation coming out of both Afghanistan and Iraq. But when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is one of these issues that has gone back eon. And to think that we can even move forward in a direction that could be generationally different for the next kid growing up in Tel Aviv or the next kid growing up in Gaza City, this is truly transformational. So, you know, I absolutely agree with you here, Katie. The president has set a new standard for what's accomplishable and thinking about it that way. I'll flash back, you know, here we were not even 2 years ago where you had Iran launching weapon systems at Israel, 300 of them in the course of a 24-hour period. But for U.S. leadership in the region, not only were U.S. fighters in the air and Israeli fighters, we had British fighters and Jordanian fighters, and God bless, we even had French fighters up there. Collectively, we were able to shoot down nearly every one of those weapon systems and provide a canopy of freedom over Israel. Most recently, I was just in Saudi Arabia and then Bahrain and UAE, and all three of these Arab countries, blood enemies of Israel, not even 5 years ago, have now all come on board since Trump 1's administration said the Abrams Peace Accord are actually a pathway for not only normalization, but for economic success, for security within our own country, and it provides them the opportunity to deal with radicals within their own country while still being able to be part of a good international playbook to make the entire region safer. Building on that, while we were in it, Saudi Arabia, bombs literally started falling on Israel, and President Trump gave the Ayatollah in Tehran a clear message that he could either come to the table or he could suffer the wrath of the United States. And the Ayatollah went into hiding and effectively slapped the president's hand away at a time where he was actually giving Iran the opportunity to come back to the peace table. And we were in the Arab countries when those B-2s took that strike. There were only 4 members of Congress who were in the region. And we heard from every single Arab leader, this is the type of peace through strength that actually makes a difference. And the president not only was right to do this, but this is one of the reasons that we will have a future aligned more with the U.S. and Israel. And so to wrap it up very quickly, Israel's role in forging a peace that brings hostages home is empowered by the fact that the United States has remained strong in this region and has not allowed our adversaries to use terrorism, to use centrifuge, or to use this type of snatch and grab that we saw on October 7th to become the playbook that goes all the way back to the days of Lebanon and when Nixon was leading. We've really got an opportunity to reset. So yes, I'm cautiously optimistic, but there's a pathway here that's not been there, at least in my lifetime.
So I'll answer that by going back 50 years. July 4th, 1976, my father was the operations chief for the 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg, which at that time just consisted of the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne Divisions. And we had a big bicentennial celebration on the main post parade field, and I can remember a young lieutenant getting up on the platform and starting to read out the names of the senior officers in both the Corps and the 82nd, and my father was one of them, and he disappeared for 2 days. Well, it just so happens that Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu and his aide, Benjamin Netanyahu, Captain Netanyahu, had landed in Entebbe in Uganda to rescue the well over 100 Israeli citizens who were taken prisoner by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And then within a year, Anwar Sadat landed in Jerusalem to break bread with Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, and the leaders of Israel. And I thought we would never see a scene as momentous as that. I think we have seen that. The difference between now and that time is that we have a president who worked hand in hand with the people of Israel, not only to combat the world's oldest hatred, but they defanged the Ayatollahs, the theocratic fanatics in Tehran, and brought the so-called Arab nation along with them. And I think Katie, in some of her broadcasts in the last few years, has remarked that the Arabs would come on board because they're a heck of a lot more worried about Persian Shia in Mecca than they ever have been about Jews praying in Jerusalem. So we have an opportunity. We have also, if we're going to bring this full circle to the great strategic problem for the United States, and that is China. The President and Prime Minister Netanyahu have removed one of the arrows from China's quiver, because I've always argued that if Xi ever decides to go for Taiwan, in the past, one call would go to Tehran, the other to Moscow, to foment troubles in those regions to divert American attention from the Pacific. So the mere fact that Iran is on its back heels in the weakest position that it has been in since the revolution in 1979 is a victory for all freedom-loving peoples, and I do hope that we have seen a new day, and perhaps we will live up to the great wish of Golda Meir that we have peace in the Middle East on that day when the Palestinians love their children more than they hate Jews.
Yeah, on the note of Iran, President Trump, when we were flying over on Air Force One, he said, even if we had made this same hostage ceasefire deal without taking out Iran's nuclear program, there would have been a dark cloud over the entire process. But there are no dark clouds now, he says. So as an observer and as someone who's covered this issue for many years, what I see now in the precarious situation of moving forward is there are two kind of separate paths here. There are the state actors, which are all of the countries and the Arab countries that want to come to the table, which are willing to come to the table, that did show up in Egypt to sign this agreement, who want to work on commerce and the economy and combating terrorism. They seem very serious about peace in the Middle East. Then, of course, you still have these factions of terrorist gangs, which have been defanged significantly, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but they still exist as an ideology, and they are, of course, now the ones causing the problems with potentially the ceasefire agreement falling apart, because they broke the ceasefire just a couple of days ago by killing 2 IDF soldiers. They're still playing games with not returning hostage bodies as they agreed to. So can you talk about the differences between those two paths, and can countries that have a history of, Iran has now been significantly set back, both nuclearly and with their ability to fund their terror proxies. But Qatar was also put on a blockade by its Arab neighbors as recently as 2018 for funding terrorism. They were harboring Hamas leaders as they were sending Palestinians to their death after launching October 7th from 6-star hotels in Doha. And also Turkey is a huge problem when it comes to enabling, funding, and harboring Hamas leaders and terrorists and signing on to this ideology. So if you guys could just, with your expertise, talk about these two different paths here and the potential for the countries that want to move forward in a modern way to help, not put the responsibility of combating this terrorism on Israel's borders, on Israel, but on the Arab states to get those territories under control.
Let's talk about the remnants of the Ottoman Empire first. Erdogan is a lot more dependent on Donald Trump than most in the Western world appreciate. He's dependent on the United States for the sustainment of his armed forces. He's dependent on the United States for the economic participation of his country in the Western economy. So Erdogan is more of an irritant than he is a terminal problem. But the issues that you raised are fascinating. I have a different view as to what happened with the Qataris and President Trump. I think the call went to Doha and said, okay, he can strike you any time he wants to. So you have a choice. You can end up like downtown Tehran, or you could help us solve this problem that has vexed every Western leader for centuries. And I think they got the message. They were also isolated by their neighbors. Look, again, once the Iran factor was not completely eliminated, but taken to a point where they were no longer a threat, and they were exposed as a paper tiger. I mean, and I'm just an Air Force intel guy. This man is a warrior, But the Israelis sent 4 planes and took out the entire Russian-based air defense system of the Ayatollahs. They were exposed. There is nothing on the part of the Arab nations to fear from Iran now. And they also understand that Donald Trump will hit the Ayatollahs if they raise their head again. So yes, there is a new day. And in terms of the historical significance, nobody ever thought that Anwar Sadat would come to Jerusalem. The front line of Arab recalcitrance against the state of Israel, he did. I think this has the potential to be already greater than that. And I do think with American leadership and the fact that there is no question that the IDF is the hegemonic military power in that region. I mean, that's not even something that you mentioned Erdogan. Erdogan's not going to tangle with the Israelis. He'll play his game, but in the end, he's going to get in line with what President Trump wants him to do.
Okay, I would highlight here that we've gone from Iran, as Secretary Wilkie highlighted, that used to be the dominant force in the Middle East, to now becoming a modern-day Syria. It is on its back heels. It doesn't have the ability to exercise external force, but it has a great desire to maintain support within the country, or at least control of the country. And so there's a real potential here that Iran is falling back into a 1979 vibe of individuals who are to the, more fanatic position than the Ayatollah. But at the same time, there's a clamoring of a country of 80 million who want desperately to throw off the shackles of what the Ayatollah has forced on them. So the good Iranians, if you can call it that, really want to see a brighter future here. The challenge is going to be twofold. One, the proxy groups run by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps and Quds Force specifically are trying to maintain external power while recognizing they've got an internal power dynamic. That means the amount of weapon sales coming out of Iran, the illicit oil sales, the drone production, the high technology partnering to either backfill Russia, to partner with China, and certainly to keep their proxies moving, does become an asymmetric threat for the region. And we should not count Iran out. My concern here also folds into the fact, as you mentioned, there are 3 terrorist elements that are largely funded through the IRGC. Hamas in Lebanon has both literally and figuratively, in many cases, been neutered by the Mossad. As a military guy, I'm not putting a pager anywhere near me. But as a result, I think it now leaves the Lebanese in a challenged position as well to say, how do we fill the void that Hamas is diminished? Second becomes Hamas itself. Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hamas in the Gaza Strip is in a equally challenged position that they're now trying to reassert their control, and lining up people in the middle of downtown Gaza City and executing them is clearly not a way to win the hearts and minds. The fear factor, the reign of terror that the Hamas group is coming back in with, I think will be short-lived for them, but it's all they've ever known, and they're certainly working with second, if not third or fourth tier leadership in the region. Which really leaves us then with this upstart Houthi rebel group, which has taken on not only outsized force in the region, but a willingness to take risks that we haven't seen since the 1970s with Iranian terror proxies. Launching sophisticated weapons into airports at Tel Aviv, taking pot shots at U.S. carrier strike groups, this becomes probably the most effective way for Iran to force project in the region. And increasingly, they're using weapons that are not coming indigenous to Iran, but through proxies in the area who want to take Israel and the U.S. to task, but are too unable or afraid to do it directly. And I think that is the space to watch in the destabilization. And I'll just double click here on Qatar now has achieved a unique status. I would say a Five Eyes level engagement with the United States. In fact, having a U.S. military operation on U.S. soil with Qatari pilots is something that we've afforded no other ally, not even the Brits, the Japanese, or Singapore. And this is a new time for us, but it has also fostered a lot of jealousy amongst Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain that there appears to be a fast track for one country and not a similar situation there. We need to be cognizant of that so we don't inadvertently fracture our partnership in a very vital part of the world for not only global energy, but global alliance.
And I would say that the president has reminded what's left of the Hamas leadership that their 70,000 Israeli soldiers pointed at them in their last enclave. And I don't think there will be any cries from the Arab leadership if Hamas does get out of line that they will be eliminated this time.
Let's address Judea, Samaria, West Bank for a minute, because it's been left out of a lot of the conversation surrounding Hamas and the Gaza Strip and the terror proxies around. Obviously, Iran's been taken off as a threat mostly. However, the West Bank is a tinderbox. It is the next Gaza. They are finding rockets. There are terror training camps. There are tons of terrorists living in the West Bank. How do they address that as a potential future problem as we're trying to move into this new era of peace in the Middle East?
Look, first of all, I visited the West Bank because I wanted to go to Jerusalem when I was in Israel. So I flew over early so I could specifically identify it. And, you know, by all outward signs, the West Bank looks not unlike Raqqa. I met a girl who was working as a barista at a Starbucks there, trained at the University of Chicago, faithful Muslim, highly intelligent, and the moment that she started speaking to me in English, a guy from behind the counter came out and just screamed and berated her that she had no business speaking. Not because I was an American, but because she was a woman having a conversation with a customer. This clash of the future of the Palestinian people, the future of Israel, comes into sharp relief because Gaza, or the West Bank, has been an area where there's actually been some investment. There's been westward-leaning opportunities. The number of people who work, you know, in Jerusalem and then cross back over to Bethlehem is real. It also means that it becomes a very permeable route for radicals to be able to infiltrate directly into Israel's capital on a moment's notice. Something that, you know, for October 7th to hit a music festival on the outskirts is different than people literally being on the other side of the wall, being able to cause mass casualty events. So with this, you know, I applaud both the IDF, Mossad specifically, for being able to provide counterintelligence in this region. But this is an area where I would absolutely want to be able to partner both with the Jordanians, who have proven to be good allies in this space, and our Arab partners to help de-radicalize the West Bank and provide a pathway here for success for the Palestinians who are in this area, who do want to see a successful future where they're not constantly locked in war with their Israeli neighbors.
And you are right, it is a tinderbox. I think one of the most corrupt, well, I don't think, one of the most corrupt kleptocracies this side of Moscow is the Palestinian Authority. The leaders of the Palestinian Authority have stolen billions of dollars. When they are not stealing, they are paying terrorists who kill Israelis. But there has to be a point, and I think the congressman is right, and this one is up to the Arabs, and I know the president has told everyone from Saudi Arabia to the Emirates to Jordan, this is on you. You have to get in there. The young people, the one of whom he just described, know what their leadership is. The good thing for us is that that leadership, I think, has an average age of about 78. And the leader, Abu Mazen, sometimes known as Mahmoud Abbas, I like to use his nom de guerre, is on his last legs. And there will be a convulsion when these people die off or are removed. And we have to offer them something other than what they have had. And that may actually be as tough or a tougher nut to crack in that part of the world than Gaza has been.
Yeah, Jared Kushner tells this great story about the first term and how when he would meet with Mahmoud Abbas, he would fly in on a private jet, he would have someone light a cigarette for him, whereas Netanyahu didn't have a government plane at the time, would fly commercial to the United States with his staff, and there was just such a stark contrast between the way the two govern, and especially when it came to the productivity of Israel versus the Palestinian Authority. Let's bring this domestic for a second. You mentioned at the beginning, Congressman, that Americans are weary of 20 years of never-ending war. What the angle of that was, especially with the disastrous and undignified withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've seen a lot of anti-Israel sentiment popping up over the course of the last 2 years. I find it just incredible that a country could suffer such a heinous attack and then become somehow the oppressors of the people who attacked them. But we are seeing this playing out in our politics, in our media, on our college campuses among young people, and that's one aspect which I'd like you both to address. The second is, we're seeing this pro-terrorism attitude among a significant number of people inside of America, combined with the fact that the previous administration let in 20 million people who they didn't know who they were. So there is a terrorist threat here, both ideologically and physically, that, thank God, we haven't seen a result of yet. Hopefully we will not. I know people are working every day very hard to prevent those types of things. But if you could address, why is Israel important to America?
Right.
What does that partnership actually look like, and how do they benefit us?
Yeah.
Why should we care? And then also address the domestic side of it.
Let me get the esoteric side of that, and I think it's one of the most important questions that we can ask. Our civilization began in the Judean desert over 3,000 years ago when Abraham came out of his tent. The foundation for the Bill of Rights came from the Ten Commandments. The foundation for our rule of law came from the teachings of Isaiah and St. Paul. And that continuum that began in the Judean desert moved to Athens, to Rome, to London, and then finally to the American Colossus. What we have engaged in this country, and you have talked about it a lot in the last 4 or 5 years, is that we have engaged in the practice of self-flagellation that borders on humiliation. Humiliation of what we have stood for, what we stand for as a Western civilization. And I'll give you one quick example from my hometown of New Orleans. New Orleans was the first place, it's the most bizarre and eclectic city in America, but it was the first place that Jews were fully integrated into society, political, cultural, economic, to the point where in the 1850s, in the city of New Orleans, a Jew left New Orleans to go to the United States Senate. That's at the same time Benjamin Disraeli was just starting out on his career in Westminster, but New Orleans sent a Jew to the U.S. Senate. And when the Ivy League had quotas and prohibitions on the admission of Jews, 2 schools in my hometown, Tulane and Jesuit Loyola, opened their doors to the point where I think Tulane's population is 40% Jewish. I never thought I would see these Marxist, Gaza-obsessed individuals rampage through Tulane and neighborhoods in the city of New Orleans. That is the great tragedy that we are facing in the West, because there's a political class. It's actually worse in France and Britain, where, by the way, in Birmingham, England, the city council has just barred the supporters of Maccabi Tel Aviv, one of Israel's two great soccer teams, from attending a soccer match between Maccabi and Aston Villa, the team in Birmingham, because the local member of parliament, a guy named Ayub Khan, says we don't support genocide. We have to take a stand in the public square. The oldest hatred is now live amongst us. But that goes to the heart of what we have been doing to ourselves for the last 50 or 60 years, where we have not taught our citizens that the United States is the last best hope on this planet, that we have given the world. I'll leave with Colin Powell, I'll end with Colin Powell. Colin Powell used to say to us that a platoon of airborne rangers has done more for the peace of the world than all the UN agencies, self-serving celebrity telethons, and virtuous politicians will ever do. And we don't herald that story. It's a much too lengthy discussion for this forum. But that's what's at the heart of it. And you want to see it, look at what's playing out in the streets of Chicago. Look at what's playing out in Seattle and Los Angeles, and what is about to happen in the city of New York, the city with more Jews than any place outside of Israel. They're about ready to get the apostle of anti-Semitism as the head of that city. And not enough people are shouting it down, particularly the senator from New York City, Mr. Schumer. And that says everything you need to know about him.
And Kay, I think, when we look at it particularly for, I look over here at the next generation of American leaders who are going to have a lot to inherit from things that we have tried to keep together and in some ways probably screwed up for you. So apologies in advance, but lots of opportunities for success.
You're doing your best.
But here's the reality. You saw it this weekend play out. You saw a group of individuals who proudly carried pro-Hamas signs, waved Palestinian flags, while on the same flagpole they had pride flags right there with it. It is a fundamental, not only misunderstanding, but willful delusion to be able to say that I am all things resistance. I am all things anti-Trump. I am all things anti-America, because I believe at some point I've had an educator who told me that America itself was the problem. And whether that is at our elite Ivy League colleges or whether it's in a high school classroom, we consistently see this politicization of and retelling of America's history, and an idea that you're either on that side or this side. And candidly, for too many kids today, for too many young people, for too many people below 40, they feel like they've got to pick a side, and often it aligns far more not with their family or their value or the principles they grew up on, but whatever they're seeing as being fashionable at the moment. And so this 3 to 5% argument ends up hijacking an entire generation. Whether you want to be boomers out there because this is what you did in Vietnam and now I'm going to go out on the weekend, it's still 3% of those guys. Whether you're Gen Z and you followed it on TikTok and you're like, the only way that I can express my hesitation is to call out Israel and therefore America and everyone else is bad. Again, a fraction of what's happening. Now, to your larger point here, 20 million illegals coming into our country does two things immediately. One, it makes it much harder for everyone who came to this country legally to be able to have a pathway to success going forward. And in my home state of Iowa, we've got some of the best Americans you're ever going to meet, and they came here legally. At the same time, you have an entire industrialization on the political side saying the only way we can get a majority in Congress is to redistrict. Not the way Texas is doing it, not the way North Carolina just did, but by having a massive number of people to count on the census who could never vote for me, but they will fundamentally change how we redistrict places like California, your home state of Arizona, certainly making a play in Texas. Across the country, Illinois can't get any more gerrymandered than it is, and I'm effectively a suburb of Chicago at this point, living in Iowa. The reality is there are people in one political party who have made a decision that this is the only way they can cling to power. And I don't mean to make this a partisan conversation, although that's what my daytime job is. is to really be able to highlight the fact that we've got to be able to call this out and just have a rational conversation here. When you find a Palestinian flag above a pride flag and stomp on the American flag, you've given up on logic to be able to be in that position.
Let me give you one more example, since we are a few months removed from Blinken and Biden. In March of 2021, Anthony Blinken met with his Chinese counterpart in Alaska. The first 30 minutes of that encounter was the Chinese foreign minister reading back the words of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden about America being a racist, oppressive nation, the font of all of the world's problems. And the only thing that Anthony Blinken could do was mouth a bunch of faculty lounge pieties about how we have to do better. Now, had that been Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, the response would have been, the United States of America is not to be lectured by a country that has murdered 100 million of its own people since 1949. But if we cannot stand up for ourselves, even rhetorically in that setting, then we are prey to the rapacious actors on the planet when it comes to a kinetic encounter. And that was so frightening about Biden and his clique, to be led by people of that ilk who had no more pride in what the United States has given to the world. The only nation in the history of the world to offer a helping hand to everyone on the planet, including its enemies, and to stand there and be berated by a jailer from Beijing. So that's...
Well, to your point, last summer, Benjamin Netanyahu came to speak to the Congress, and there was a massive riot, turned into a riot, as they usually do, outside of Union Station, which of course is steps away from the U.S. Capitol. And during that demonstration, the pro-Palestinian, which is the same thing as being pro-Hamas, ripped down all 3 American flags at Union Station in the nation's capital, burned them, and then hoisted up their own Palestinian flags outside of the Union Station, just steps away again from the White House and from the U.S. Capitol. So that was jarring. And then a month later, Joe Biden...
I will say, we hoisted 3 American flags.
Yes.
Members of Congress marched
next day.
from
Right.
it to hoist them back up and replace it.
And then a month later, to your point about the Biden administration, the same kind of protesters show up at the DNC, and Joe Biden gets on stage and says that they have a point. So this seems to be a very serious problem. One thing on the foundation of the country, the land of Israel is foundational to America, and George Washington, the first president, after they won the American Revolution, wrote a letter to a congregation in Savannah and said, essentially, that the exodus from Egypt was the inspiration for the rebels in America to take on the British Empire and establish a new nation. When they were looking for a new seal for the United States of America, Benjamin Franklin proposed, along with Thomas Jefferson, I believe, a seal of Moses leading his people out of Egypt to the land of Israel. So these two things are foundationally and deeply connected beyond just the modern day politics.
And what Washington preached was not tolerance. He preached revolutionary acceptance, that you could sit under your fig and vine tree in peace in this new world. And that was the beginning of the notion of America as the lifeboat, the last hope. And what we're seeing in the streets, and particularly in our universities, if we don't stand up to it, the consequences will not just be for us, but for the entire world.
Let's move on the map a little bit. Let's go to Russia, Ukraine. The president just had a meeting with President Zelensky at the White House. They were planning on doing another summit in Europe here in the next couple of weeks. That seems to be put on hold. There was some talk of giving the Ukrainians Tomahawk missiles. That has now been taken off the table. The president recently said, which was very different than what he talked about previously, that he believes Ukraine can take back all of their territory. We had the summit in Anchorage with Vladimir Putin. Where do we stand with this situation? It seems that the Ukrainians are doing everything that the White House wants them to do, and yet Putin is still refusing to even come to the table in good faith for negotiation.
Well, look, the notion that anyone should be surprised by what the Russians have pulled. I mean, they have rejected the last 3 offers of a ceasefire, which Zelensky has accepted. And once, I think, once they realized that for the time being the tomahawks were off the table, it was the threat of the tomahawks that prompted that call from Vlad the Impaler. Then they came to the table, and then once that was not in the cards, they pulled back. Look, we have an opportunity here, and I'll talk about it a little more in my formal remarks later, to really put a dent into this triumvirate of terror. We've already seen what has happened to the Iranians. And with the Russians, standing up to them and giving the Ukrainians the tools that they need to defend themselves actually weakens China in the end, because it cuts off many of its avenues for mischief. But the Ukrainians have done a remarkable thing. But for us, they have reminded us two lessons. One, the peer-on-peer lessons of the 20th century when it comes to military engagement are still with us. Two, a smaller nation with incredible dexterity, flexibility when it comes to the use of high tech can really land significant blows on a larger nation. And I was talking to Katie before, a country without a navy has wiped out a surface fleet in the Black Sea. A country without much of an air force has destroyed 1/3 of the strategic bomber force of the world's largest nuclear power in terms of the number of warheads that they possess. And look, if anybody thinks that that Putin will stop if he is victorious in Ukraine, then that is a complete negation of what we know of Russian history. And you know, the obscene, I quote the late Christopher Hitchens when he talks about Russian history, the obscene wickedness of Russia's history is there for all of us to see. From the pogroms, the anti-Semitism, the Black Hundreds, the massacres of civilians. And I'll just say, I did see President Zelensky after his meeting with President Trump, and what he pointed out was that there will be more stories of Russian atrocities. What is Putin doing now? He's attacking civilians. He just took out a farmer's market on Sunday. And I just want to knock down one argument. This notion that providing him with weapons, Zelensky with weapons to strike back, is somehow an escalation. Russia has been raining ballistic missiles on Ukraine for 3 years now. And giving the Ukrainians the ability to strike back with similar systems is not an escalation. That is a logical response to Russian terror. But we need to help. We need to get Europe back on track where it has lived off of the largesse of the American people for most of the post-war era. And if anything will come good out of that, it is that at least some of the European nations, including the Germans, are waking up to their responsibilities.
Yeah, Congressman, I've been to Europe twice this year, both for NATO and for the Dubrovnik Forum, and was in Europe the summer before, and it seemed like they almost had to be shocked into reality about what it means to have a defense. The president has been adamant about, and he said, we will transfer weapons that are purchased by NATO, and you can transfer them to Ukraine, but we are getting out of the business of arming Ukraine. Is it past time for these European countries not to even think that they need U.S. weapons, but time for them to grow up, get up to the plate, and solve this problem for themselves?
Katie, I think you reflect on not just traveling with the president on here, but where there's been a seismic shift, just even pre-Biden. We had a situation here where the president, for everyone who feared that President Trump was going to be a hands-off president on the world stage, he has taken more directive role in forming a more secure world than we were even 6 months ago. We have seen that, and again, when we were in Bahrain, the foreign minister said, you know, we have worked with the Ayatollah as a communication conduit to the White House for decades. And the Ayatollah, on the eve of President Trump's strike, said, don't tell us how to manage presidents. We've been managing presidents for 4 decades. We know how to stretch this out to be in our benefit. The next night, the Ayatollah woke up to his entire nuclear program wiped off the face of the earth. The reality here is that the president has also had the same opportunity to lead with Russia and Ukraine. And I would say it's threefold. First and foremost, the Ukrainians, when they first came over, had an expectation the United States was going to fight and win this war for them. And the president made very clear, this is Ukraine's job first and foremost. And I have done election monitoring in Ukraine when they were doing their parliamentary elections. I've seen in Zaporizhia where separatists literally put minefields around polling stations, and I've watched little babushkas walk through minefields to vote because they never want to go back to the way it was under the Stalinist regime that got them there in the first place. The resolve of the Ukrainian people, I feel fully that they are committed to their own independence. The second piece was Europe. And I think this is absolutely correct, that the post-World War II and certainly post-Cold War environment has been the United States is here to do the heavy lifting, and candidly, the American taxpayer, they kind of owe it to us. And they've been living off this Marshall Plan attitude of, we'll do the front-facing, and certainly there are great allies in here, the UK being one of them. But there are far too many in Europe who have decided to outsource their entire national security to allow the largesse of their social safety network to come first and foremost. We finally have a NATO that's putting up the required 5% of their own national defense. And you're absolutely right. Whatever happens in Ukraine will end up happening on Europe's border if Europe doesn't stand up to this. But what I've told every European member of parliament who's come and asked for more, I said the United States has responsibilities in Europe, in the Middle East, certainly in Asia, but first and foremost, we have responsibilities right here at home. And that means we've got to spend our resources on where the taxpayer told us to do that, and that's on the home front. So the last piece then goes to, how do we collectively stand up to Russia? The Ukraine-Russia conflict needs to be decided by all 3 parties involved. But first and foremost, the United States should not walk away from what Putin has put on on all of our plate. By being a hostile actor, by being willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of his own people, by destroying a generation of military equipment in a failed onslaught, it exposes not only how weak Russia is, but how dogmatic Putin is in saying at all costs, I will take back Crimea and Donbass, and eventually I will reclaim the pre-Soviet empire of the czars. We know that to be unrealistic. I don't think Putin does. We've been leading the Peace Act. It is a Republican-led effort to put real sanctions on Russia. And it has not only garnered broad bipartisan support, like the tomahawks, it is one of the best ways that we can stand up to Russia and force them to come not only back to the table, but recognize we're serious about this. 5% NATO spending, real sanctions, and the opportunity for our allies, whether it's Patriot weapon systems in Poland or Tomahawks potentials in Ukraine, it's forced Russia for the first time to really come to reality that they're not going to be able to do this. Now, I give the president a lot of credit that he has been patient, he has been consistent, and he has attempted at every time to seek peace between these 2 partners. But when you have one partner, not unlike Israel, facing Hamas, who says we're willing to work together, and you have another partner like Russia who is attempting to play the Ayatollah's game of we're going to continue to stretch negotiations as long as possible and hope for a breakthrough, at some point they've slapped the hand of the United States away too many times, and you have to hold Putin accountable.
Let me give you an example, Katie, is what I meant by living under the protection of the eagle. And I'll attack our great neighbor to the north, Canada. When I was born, my father was a young lieutenant in the 3rd Armored Division. Canada had the 4th largest army in NATO. Eisenhower said the finest troops he commanded in World War II were Canadian. Their battle record was second to none. Today, the Canadian Army is the size of the Alabama National Guard, our 30th largest state. There are 50 pilots in the Canadian Air Force, 50, and 16 of them are assigned to the Snowbirds demonstration team for air shows. The United Kingdom and Germany, their combined end strength for their armies is smaller than the number of troops that Lithuania can put into the field. Britain, Germany, the fourth and fifth largest economies on the planet. The Royal Navy is the smallest it has been since the Dutch rampaged up the Thames in 1658. And it has fallen on the United States to carry this burden. Trump is saying enough. He's not saying America alone. That's not the message. But America needs its partners. And the congressman is right. They have established this massive cradle-to-grave state because of the generosity of the American people. And they had better get their act together. And I can pick on the Canadians some more, but I won't since Trudeau is busy on a yacht with a pop singer someplace.
Right, and who could forget that the Europeans are still funding Putin's war by buying their energy as a result of
$5 billion a year from France alone, and we have to listen to Macron's lectures.
Right, it's quite incredible. Okay, with the remaining time, I want to get to China. We talked a little bit earlier about China's latest antics with restricting rare earths, restricting material, the president's efforts to mine rare earths here in America. But overall, what is your assessment with our position with China right now, and maybe some of the hot spots we should be looking for?
So I wish we would have had the opportunity to start with this, because in my opinion, this is the singular most pressing national security threat, and it's one that's going to echo long beyond the next 3 years of the Trump administration. But I will say Trump has gotten it right from day one. This is the trade war that we have to have now, so we don't have capitulation war 10 years from now. We have an opportunity here to fundamentally reshape how we hold China accountable. And I sit on the China Select Committee and the China Commission, both of which are bipartisan, but which have overwhelming need to be able to say China's dilatory behavior in this area, everything from direct capture of rare earth minerals to deploying bio threats through agricultural trades at the University of Michigan, not only are real, they are intentional. And the design by President Xi to find every measure to undermine the United States and our partners in the region, it should be a coalesce force between the U.S., our European allies where they're paying attention, but certainly great leaders in the region like Japan, South Korea, Australia, to some extent New Zealand, Singapore, and increasingly India. They may be the single galvanizing factor to bring all these countries together. That said, they also have the ability to outpace us on nearly every level. As is highlighted here, one shipyard in China today has produced more ships in the last year than the entire U.S. Navy did since World War II. We need to recognize that they are operating at a level beyond checkers and chess. They are playing Go to fence in the United States in a way that we alone are not going to be able to compete against. And yes, onshoring here is important. But if the Taiwan factor took place today, the amount of chips we would lose would devastate the entire world and empower China in a way we can't even imagine. And it doesn't even have to be militarily. I mean, simply allowing the Chinese to have economic control over Taiwan, to have outsized political voice in Taiwan. We just saw this week the new shadow prime minister, or who will soon be the prime minister if left unchecked, has said, not only do I want to have peace with China, I want to invite China into Taiwan. It is much more realistic that the Chinese take Taiwan in the next 5 years in a Hong Kong-style approach of certainly overwhelming it than Chinese Marines showing up on the shore and we have to deploy a carrier strike group. Because while I am fully confident in Pappy and everybody in INDOPACOM to be able to do their job, showing up with a carrier strike group doesn't matter when the folks in Taipei have just elected a pro-communist leader in charge of their country.
The United States burst onto the world stage because Thomas Jefferson had a notion of American commerce sailing the global commons. That's what he called it. And in the Mediterranean, the Barbary pirates were taking American ships, imprisoning American sailors, and forcing them to either convert to Islam or die. Thomas Jefferson had two things happen. His two fundamental hatreds, organized religion and hereditary monarchy, sprang up, and he dispatched the entire United States Navy to Algiers. The Marine Corps landed in what is now Libya, cut a path of devastation over 1,000 miles, and a young Stephen Decatur sent a note to the Bay of Algiers: you either surrender or we burn you down. If Taiwan falls, China controls the world's busiest sea lanes. The prime directive of American foreign policy since Thomas Jefferson has been to protect global sea lanes. And this is where I get a little critical. At the Department of Defense, you all have seen all of the thunder and lightning about push-ups and the rest. That's important. I mean, I'm the son of an airborne ranger. I grew up watching men in red berets who could do amazing things physically. But the maintenance on our nuclear attack submarine fleet alone, just the maintenance, would take the full capacity of our shipyards for the next 30 years. We were about ready to, well, not ready, because when I was Undersecretary of Defense, I signed off on a $7 billion carrier. That carrier is still in Newport News, and the price tag is now hitting $17 billion. That's the battle line of 1940s. And they may be great against the Houthis, but as the congressman hinted, in any war game that we have conducted about Taiwan and China, the carriers don't make it. Now, we could put 6 nuclear attack submarines in the water for one carrier. But the point is, we have to be serious. The one advantage that we do have in the region is that China is surrounded by nations with 5,000-year memories of Chinese aggression and imperialism. They are very capable. We have just seen the elevation of the Iron Lady of Asia to the premiership in Tokyo. She is very realistic, and she is throwing off all of the shackles of the pacifist enterprise that rightfully in 1945 was foisted on the Japanese. We're going to be back, hopefully, in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. The Indians are not going to, despite all of the stuff in the press, India believes that in a few years they will overtake China as the world's premier economic power, and also the world's largest nation. They're not going to play games, but we have to create the scenario where it is prohibitively expensive for Xi to intimidate, much less come across those straits. We have to get serious about our own defense. We need more pilots, we need more ships. Again, back to Ukraine, they have shown us the way. With our high tech, we can give the Taiwanese the means to keep that 110-mile strait free of Chinese ships, because we create a hedgehog there and it's prohibitively expensive for them to come across those straits. But we have serious, serious business to do at the Department of Defense, and I think Congress really needs to step up, particularly the Senate, and take the lead.
Is it time for the president to issue an emergency declaration for shipbuilding, for
Yes.
reestablishing our defenses, our shells,
Right.
all the production?
One of the things I wrote, and I was responsible for the transition plan for the Department of Defense, was to use what we used at VA during the COVID emergency, and that was the Defense Production Act. It works. We have to force feed industry to do the things we need to do. Mundane things in some respects, precision guided munitions, artillery shells, drones, both aerial and undersea. Those are the things we need. We do need more vessels, but we have to look at the 21st century, not be hidebound by what happened off Okinawa in 1945.
And Katie, I would say very quickly here, the Secretary is absolutely right here. I'm privileged that I sit on financial services, and it's actually Financial Services that's leading the Defense Production Act, and it's up this year. Now, normally, so we all recognize, the National Defense Authorization Act is a one-year spending bill that goes, it's about as schizophrenic as Congress can be on what we want to spend things on. And we make a lot of requests of the department, we give them a little bit of money, and then we have an expectation by next year it's all going to be better. We recognize this also, though, that the production and acquisition within the department is not only not working, it's hard broke. DPA gives us the opportunity to be a little bit more strategic in our approach to this, to be able to identify what the top tiers are. And this comes out of, nobody was building landing craft when we went into Korea at the beginning of the Korean War, but it gave Truman and then Eisenhower the opportunity to say, somebody at Chevrolet Motor Company needs to help us construct these things. A new aspect that we're putting in the DPA this year, it's our amendment, this guy in the back here, Andrew, wave your hand, is helping write the Force Act. Not only because we're Star Wars fans, but because we're trying to get the best people in the room to say, how does industry help advise on this? If we take one thing away from what the Ukrainians and the Israelis have been able to do, and candidly the Taiwanese now, is that they've been able to onboard commercial technology, innovation, and execution at a much higher rate than we're able to do here in the United States. This is certainly a lesson the Russians have learned in their acquisition. We should be taking a lesson away from the Ukrainians, not following a model that hasn't worked for us since pre-World War II. DPA is part of the situation. Katie, I would also add just here on our way out, that we also need to recognize traditional warfare in the way that we've seen Russia and Ukraine fight is quickly changing. And what China is doing is not only direct competition with the United States with its new mega cruiser, the super cruiser or a carrier that they've just built, but they're also funding our biggest adversaries right here in the New World. And when you look at where Colombian drug lords and Venezuelan gangs and South American and Central American threats are coming from, it is the source material they're getting from China, it is the weapons they're getting, and it is the military advisors who are showing up in the New World just south of our border, who are going to be the asymmetric threat that we're going to have to contend with in the same way Israel has had to contend with asymmetric threats throughout the entire Middle East. This is where we need to be partnering with our allies and recognizing there are great best practices out there. America better get smart real quick.
Modernization. All right, we are out of time. We could keep talking, but thank you both very much. I know you have places to be. Thank you.